Hi, sweetie, it's Nana. I decided I was going to read you another story, and then if you decide you really don't want to listen to them this way anymore, I'll just bring the book with me next time I come, and if you're up for a story, I'll read to you. This one is called The Last Visit, and there is the picture. I suppose there was a wry humor in the fact that my call-up papers arrived on my birthday, but I didn't see the joke at the time. The event is preserved in my memory in a picture which is as clear to me today as when I walked into our dining room that morning. Helen perched away up on her high stool at the end of the table, very still, eyes downcast. By the side of my plate, my birthday present, a tin of Dobie's blue square tobacco, and next to it a long envelope. I didn't have to ask what it contained. I had been expecting it for some time, but it still gave me a jolt to find I had only a week before presenting myself at the Lord Cricket Ground, St. John's Wood, London. And that week went by at frightening speed as I made my final plans, tidying up loose ends in the practice, getting my Ministry of Agriculture form sent off, arranging for our few possessions to be taken to Helen's old home where she would stay while I was away. Having decided that I would finish work at tea time on Friday, I had a call from Arnold Summergill at about 3 o'clock that afternoon, and I knew that would be my very last job because it was always an expedition rather than a visit to his small holding which clung to a bracken-strewn slope in the depths of the hills. I didn't speak directly to Arnold, but to Miss Thompson, the postmistress in Hainby Village. Mr. Summergill wants you to come and see his dog, she said over the phone. What's the trouble? I asked. I heard a muttered consultation at the far end. He says it's a leg gone funny. Funny? What do you mean funny? Again, the quick babble of voices. He says it's kind of sticking out. All right, I said, I'll be along very soon. It was no good asking for the dog to be brought in. Arnold had never owned a car, nor had he ever spoken on a telephone. All of our conversations had been carried on through the medium of Miss Thompson. Arnold would mount in his rusty bicycle pedal to Hainby and tell his troubles to postmistress. And the symptoms? They were typically vague, and I didn't suppose there would be anything either funny or sticking out about the leg when I saw it. Anyway, I thought as I drove out of Darrowby, I wouldn't mind having a last look at Benjamin. It was a fanciful name for a small farmer's dog, and I never really found out how he had acquired it. But after all, he was an unlikely breed for such a setting, a massive old English sheepdog who would have looked more in place decorating the lawns of a stately home than following his master round Arnold's stony pastures. He was a classical example of the walking hearthrug, and it took a second look to decide which end of him was which. But when you did manage to locate his head, you found two of the most benevolent eyes imaginable glinting through the thick fringe of hair. Benjamin was, in fact, too friendly at times, especially in winter when he had been strolling in the farmyard mud and showed his delight in my arrival by planting his huge feet on my chest. He did the same thing to my car too, usually just after I had washed it, smearing clay lavishly over the windows and bodywork while exchanging pleasantries with Sam inside. When Benjamin made a mess of anything, he did it right. But I had to interrupt my musings when I reached the last stage of my journey, and as I hung on to the kicking, jerking wheel and listened to the creaking and groaning of springs and shock absorbers, the thought forced its way into my mind, as it always did around here, that it cost us money to come to Mr. Summergill's farm. There could be no profit from the business because his vicarious track must knock at least 5 pounds off the value of the car on every trip. Since Arnold did not have a car himself, he saw no reason why he should interfere with the primeval state of the road. It was simply a 6-foot strip of earth and rock, and it wound and twisted for an awful long way. The trouble was that to get to the farm, you had to descend into a deep valley before climbing through a wood toward the house. I, thinking going down was worse because the vehicle hovered agonizingly on the top of each ridge before plunging into the yawning ruts beyond, and each time listening to the unyielding stone grating on sump and exhaust. I tried to stop myself working out the damage in pounds, shillings, and pence. And when at last, mouth gaping, eyes popping, tires sending the sharp pebbles flying, I ground my way upwards in bottom gear over the last few yards leading to the house, I was surprised to see Arnold waiting for me there alone. It was unusual to see him without Benjamin. He must have read my questioning look because he jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "He's in the house," he grunted, and his eyes were anxious. I got out of the car and looked at him for a moment as he stood there in a typical attitude, wide shoulders back, head high. I have called him old, and indeed he was over 70, but the features beneath the woolen tammy which he always wore pulled down over his ears were clean and regular, and the tall figure lean and straight. He was a fine-looking man and must have been handsome in his youth, yet he had never married. I often felt there was a story there, but he seemed content to live here alone. A bit of a hermit, as they say in the village. Alone, that is, except for Benjamin. As I followed him into the kitchen, he casually shooed out a couple of hens who had been perching on a dusty dresser. Then I saw Benjamin and pulled up with a jerk. The big dog was sitting quite motionless by the side of the table, and this time the eyes behind the overhanging hair were big and liquid with fright. He appeared to be too terrified to move, and when I saw his left foreleg, I couldn't blame him. Arnold had been right after all. It was indeed sticking out with a vengeance, at an angle which made my heart give a quick double thud, a complete lateral dislocation of the elbow, the radius projecting away out from the humerus at an almost impossible obliquity. I swallowed carefully. "When did this happen, Mr. Summergill?" "Just an hour since." He tugged worriedly at his strange headgear. "I was changing the cows into another field, and odd Benjamin likes to have a nip at their heels when he's behind 'em. Well, he did it once or often, and one of them lashed out and got him on the leg." I see. My mind was racing. This thing was grotesque. I had never seen anything like it. In fact, 30 years later, I still haven't seen anything like it. How on earth was I going to reduce the thing away up here in the hills? By the look of it, I would need general anesthesia and a skilled assistant. "Poor old lad," I said, resting my hand on the shaggy head as I tried to think. "What are we going to do with you?" The tail whisked along the flags, and in reply, and the mouth opened in a nervous panting, giving a glimpse of the flawlessly white teeth. Arnold cleared his throat. "Can you put 'em right?" Well, it was a good question. An airy answer might give the wrong impression, yet I didn't want to worry him with my doubts. It would be a mammoth task to get the enormous dog down to Darrowby. He nearly filled the kitchen, never mind my little car, and with that leg sticking out, and with Sam already in residence, and would I be able to get the joint back in place when I got him there? And even if I did manage it, I would still have to bring him all the way back up here. It would just about take care of the rest of the day. Gently, I passed my fingers over the dislocated joint and searched my memory for details of the anatomy of the elbow. For the leg to be in this position, the processus enconeus must have been completely disengaged from the supracondyloid fossa, where it normally lay, and to get it back, the joint would have to be flexed until the enconeus was clear of the epicondyles. "Now let's see," I murmured to myself. "If I had this dog anesthetized and on a table, I would have to get hold of him like this." I grasped the leg just above the elbow and began to move the radius slowly upwards. Benjamin gave me a quick glance and turned his head away, a gesture typical of good-natured dogs, conveying the message that he was going to put up with whatever I thought it was necessary to do. I fixed the joint still further until I was sure the enconeus was clear, then carefully rotated the radius and the ulna inwards. Yes, I muttered, this must be about the right position. But my soliloquy was interrupted by a sudden movement of the bones under my hand, a springing, flicking sensation. I looked incredulously at the leg. It was perfectly straight. Benjamin, too, seemed unable to take it in right away, because he peered cautiously round through his shaggy curtain before lowering his nose and sniffing around the elbow. Then he seemed to realize all was well and ambled over to his master, and he was perfectly sound, not a trace of limp. A slow smile spread over Arnold's face. "You've mended him, then?" "Looks like it, Mr. Somergill." I tried to keep my voice casual, but I felt like cheering or bursting into hysterical laughter. I had only been making an examination, feeling things out a little, and the joint had popped back into place. A glorious accident. "Aye, well, that's grand," the farmer said. "Isn't it all, lad?" He bent and tickled Benjamin's ear. I could have been disappointed by this laconic reception of my performance, but I realized it was a compliment to me that he wasn't surprised that I, James Herriot, his vet, should effortlessly produce a miracle when it was required. A theater full of cheering students would have rounded off the incident, or it would be nice to do this kind of thing to some millionaire's animal in a crowded drawing room, but it never happened that way. I looked around the kitchen at the cluttered table, the pile of unwashed crockery in the sink, a couple of Arnold's ragged shirts drying before the fire, and I smiled to myself. This was the sort of setting in which I usually pulled off my spectacular cures. The only spectators here, apart from Arnold, were the two hens who had made their way back on top of the dresser, and they didn't even particularly seem impressed. "Well, I'll be getting back down the hill," I said, and Arnold walked with me across the yard to the car. "I hear you're off to join up," he said as I put my hand on the door. "Yes, I'm away tomorrow, Mr. Somergill." "Tomorrow, eh?" He raised his eyebrows. "Yes, to London. Ever been there?" Nay be damned." The woolen cap quivered as he shook his head. "That'd be no good to me." I laughed. "What do you say that? Why do you say that?" "Well, now, I tell ye." He scratched his chin ruminatively. "Nabout went once to Broughton, and that was enough. I couldn't walk on de street." "Couldn't walk?" "Nay, there were that many people 'bout. I 'ad to take big steps and little uns, and then big steps and little uns again. Couldn't get going." I had often seen Arnold stalking over his fields with the long, even stride of the hillman, with nothing in his way, and I knew exactly what he meant. Big steps and little uns. That put it perfectly. I started the engine and waved as I moved away. The old man raised a hand. "Take care, lad," he murmured. I spotted Benjamin's nose just peeping round the kitchen door. Any other time he would have been out with his master to see me off the premises, but it had been a strange day for him, culminating with my descending on him and mauling his leg about. He wasn't taking any more chances. I drove gingerly down through the wood, and before starting up the track on the other side, I stopped the car and got out, with Sam leaping eagerly after me. This was a little lost valley in the hills, a green cleft cut off from the wild country above. One of the bonuses in a country vet's life is that he sees these hidden places. Apart from old Arnold, nobody ever came down here, not even the postman who left the infrequent mail in a box at the top of the track. And nobody saw the blazing scarlets and golds of autumn's trees, nor heard the busy clucking and murmuring of the beck among its clean-washed stones. I walked along the water's edge, watching the little fish darting and flitting in the cool depths. In the spring, these banks were bright with primroses, and in May, a great sea of bluebells flowed among the trees. But today, though the sky was an untroubled blue, the clean air was touched with the sweetness of the drying year. I climbed a little way up the hillside and sat down among the bracken, now fast turning to bronze. Sam, as was his way, flopped by my side, and I ran a hand over the silky hair of his ears. The far side of the valley rose steeply to where, above the gleaming ridge of limestone cliffs, I could just see the sunlit rim of the moor. I looked back to where the farm chimney sent a thin tendril of smoke from behind the brow of the hill, and it seemed that the episode with Benjamin, my last job in veterinary practice before I left Darrowby, was a fitting epilogue. A little triumph, intensely satisfying but by no means world-shaking, like all the other little triumphs and disasters which make up a veterinary surgeon's life but go unnoticed by the world. Last night, after Helen had packed my bag, I had pushed Black's veterinary dictionary in among the shirts and socks. It was a bulky volume, but I had been gripped momentarily by a fear that I might forget the things I had learned, and conceived on an impulse the scheme of reading a page or two each day to keep my memory fresh. And here, among the bracken, the thought came back to me that it was the greatest and good fortune not only to be fascinated by animals, but to know about them. Suddenly, the knowing became a precious thing. I went back and opened the car door. Sam jumped onto the seat, and before I got in, I looked away down in the other direction from the house to the valley's mouth, where the hills parted to give a glimpse of the plain below. And the endless wash of pale tints, the gold of the stubble, the dark smudges of wood, the mottled greens of the pasture land were like a perfect watercolor. I found myself staring greedily as if for the first time at the scene which had so often lifted my heart, the great, wide, clean-blown face of Yorkshire. I would come back to it all, I thought as I drove away, back to my work. How was it that book had described it? My hard, honest, and fine profession. I keep telling my young assistants that they must not become frustrated when receiving no credit for doing a brilliant job, because they will often get disproportionate praise for something easy. It is a strange thing, but I have reduced several dislocated elbows during my career, and in every case there was only one unimpressed person to see it. A pity, because it does look so good, and yet this single-handed piece of work seems to epitomize my life before entering the RAF. It was a very fitting last visit. Well, that's it for this story, sweetie. And I guess you'll let me know if I should read any more. Love you. See you next time.